We're ready to begin. Good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure today to bring back to our AEDY team, Dr. Steve Pfeiffer. Our continued conversation today in part two will be specific to meeting the needs within AEDY and really most educational settings on the neurological approach to our trauma-informed support for our staff and students. And so I want to welcome on behalf of our AEDY team here today, Dr. Steve Pfeiffer. Just two housekeeping bits of information before we begin, and I provide the background information for our speaker again today. First and foremost, we definitely as an AEDY team want to provide you with an opportunity to ask questions throughout our presentation this morning. We will allot a period of time at the end of the presentation to address those. Different today, we are not in meeting format, we are in webinar. So we ask you to put them in the Q&A section, and my team members here today will be organizing our questions for the end of presentation. The second bit of just housekeeping before we begin is that you will notice that you have the opportunity at the base of your screen for accessibility within the CC, closed captioning, and you can select your preferred mode of interaction with our presentation today just by simply clicking that live transcript caret and selecting whether you want to keep that on or off today. So without further ado, I want to give our full attention and certainly time today. We never have enough of that, Dr. Pfeiffer. So I just want to give a little bit of background again. Dr. Steve Pfeiffer is a renowned speaker and author of 8 books, numerous articles on learning and emotional disorders for children. He's a licensed psychologist with more than 20 years of experience working within schools and is dually trained in school neuropsychology, having completed research stints at the NIH, the National Institute of Health. Dr. Pfeiffer has earned numerous distinctions throughout his career, including the Maryland School Psychologist of the Year, the National School Psychologist of the Year, and most recently received the Outstanding Contribution to the Education and Training of Psychologists awarded by the Maryland Psychology Association. Dr. Pfeiffer currently assesses children at the Monocacy Neurodevelopmental Center in Frederick, Maryland, and is a consultant to a variety of school districts, as well as us here today. He has authored 3 tests on diagnosing learning disabilities in children, all of which are published by PAR, P-A-R. So welcome, Dr. Pfeiffer. We're looking forward to this opportunity today. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Gina, and I appreciate having me back. And what a mouthful of an introduction, so kind. Great to be back with everybody today. And as Gina alluded, this is really part 2 of a conversation we started back in December with our workshop entitled The Neuropsychology of Stress and Trauma, How to Develop a Trauma-Informed School. And we tried to define trauma and talked about 5 ways, 5 strategies so we can become more informed as educators about trauma and meeting the needs of our students. That's a lot to cover in an hour. So in part 2 of our series, what I'd like to do is take this a little bit more directly to the needs of AEDY youth. Still within that framework of a neuropsychological approach. You will see my email on the very first slide, as well as the last slide. It's always a challenge to take questions by way of webinar. We're going to try our very best today. If we don't get to your question, we run out of time, you have more of an extended question, please don't hesitate. That is how you reach me. Okay, with that said, what I thought we'd try to cover today, and this is going to be a lot, so strap on your seatbelts because here we go. I want to talk about, let's pull the lens back to 30,000 feet, and let's kind of take a look at this broad issue we have. Alternative education for disruptive youth. Who are those students? Who exactly are they? And to what extent has trauma and really the entire COVID-19 experience contributed to the needs of all students, but especially our AEDY students? As we know, when those students make their return back to school, we write behavior plans, we write transition plans. Are there limitations to those plans? You know, what are the realistic expectations after 45 days in terms of getting back into school? We're going to pivot from there and dive into the brain a little bit. You know me, I mean, that's my background. How can I do a talk without talking about the brain? We're going to look at self-regulation in the brain and then pivot again back into the classroom, and we'll finish up with a few assessment and progress monitoring tools. That's a lot to cover. Here we go. Okay, you know this better than me, okay? Basic facts. Let's start out with our first bullet point in terms of just who are these students, basic facts about AEDY. Gina's going to correct me if I'm wrong here, but we have students who in this program, about 40% are students with disabilities who wind up in an alternative placement. Many others are there, as we know, because of just chronic truancy. Now, interesting enough, students with disabilities also represent a lot of those students who are chronically truant. About 50% more likely to be truant from school if you have a disability. However, we know that to arrive at an alternative education placement, it's not just because you have a disability, it's not just because you missed a lot of school. That's not quite sufficient for placement. There has to take that next step. Persistent violation of school rules, weapons, drugs, committing a crime, improper conduct, and so forth. We know that our goal is to try to get these students back into their home educational environment, and that exit plan usually has to occur within 45 days. And as part of that plan, it's going to include a transition plan. It's going to include a behavior plan. And what I found was interesting and recently passed in the state of Pennsylvania, Act 18, recognized that trauma-informed training is also should be a part of this plan. That through a multi-tiered system of support, MTSS, and if that's not the buzzword in education these days, I don't know what is, but within a series of supports and tiers, MTSS approach, it's essential to facilitate this transition. What that is suggesting is that one universal theme that seems to be common among all of these students is there's some essence of trauma, and therefore some sort of trauma-informed training in addition to that behavior plan is going to be essential to facilitate this transition back to school. Now, specifically, who are these students? I think it's always helpful when we go through a particular presentation to have a student in mind. So maybe the student in mind we're going to talk about today is Billy. Is Billy an AEDY student? He's 12 years old. Billy's ADHD. He needs lots of accommodations. He doesn't plan well. He's not very well organized, as is the case with most kids with ADHD. What is the single academic skill they struggle with the most? Written language, because writing requires the most planning, the most organization, or as we say, the most frontal lobe functioning of any of our academic skills. Billy's interrupting the teacher. He's a disruption. Alternative ed for disruptive youth. Does Billy fit that profile? Here might be a potential student. Generally now Sam's a little young. We know AEDY, 12 years and older, but here's Sam. Now Sam has a disability, as do 40% of the youth in AEDY. Pretty strong academically. That's not quite our issue, although, you know, reading comprehension, not quite his strength, but Sam's on the spectrum, and his issues are more socially. Few friends, very awkward, very immature with others. He has a condition that I refer to as social dyslexia. He doesn't have any trouble reading words. He has trouble reading people, reading social cues from other people. He's very anxious. He's very behaviorally immature. He's having a hard time feeling comfortable at school. This is a truancy issue. He's not coming right now. Is this the type of student we're talking about with AEDY youth? Well, here's one that's probably more traditional. Joe's a 16-year-old high school student. I say this because I have a brother, Joe, and this really reminds me of my brother's profile. Brilliant. Joe's brilliant. IQ off the charts, brilliant, 135. And despite that rocket power IQ, he's underachieving in school. Puts forth minimal effort, rarely turns in assignments, keeps to himself, socially isolated, participates in no school activities, completely withdrawn, shows every sign of depression. Joe is also a truancy issue. He skips school in lieu of getting high, either by himself or with friends. Is this a candidate for AEDY? I think when we think of an alternative setting, an alternative educational setting for disruptive youth, though, the person that comes to mind most is Martin. Oh, Martin, that fiery redhead Martin. Martin is 13 in the 6th grade. Whoa, 13 in the 6th grade. Aren't you supposed to be like in the 8th grade when you're 13? Yeah, well, Martin's been held back a couple of times. He does not manage his emotional impulses very well. He's been suspended numerous times for fighting. He uses inappropriate language. He destroys school property. This is your typical candidate, right, for an alternative setting. But I think the point being, what we're seeing is that youth in an alternative setting represent quite a heterogeneous population. Some of the youth act out. Some of the youth, like Joe, act in. There's an undercurrent of mental health issues, not for all, but for a good chunk of these kids. And somewhere circulating among all of them, if we look a little deeper in their background, is probably some element of trauma as well. Now, again, if you want to look at the mental health part and just some fast facts about mental health disorders, it's pretty prevalent, okay? We have an estimated 17 million or 22% of kids have some sort of mental health condition. And yes, we're including ADHD into that mix. We know that most psychiatric illnesses occur before the age of 14 and 75 by age 24. But what are they? When we talk about mental health issues with kids, it's a combination, and this is all speaking to the point of who are our youth in an alternative setting. ADHD kids, kids with behavior problems, anxiety, depression. These are some of the most common mental health disorders in childhood. How common? Well, over 9% of kids, excuse me, have received an ADHD diagnosis. 7% have some sort of behavior problem. 7% diagnosed anxiety, and a little less frequent, 3% have depression. Bottle that up. What are we looking like at AEDY? This is a nice graphic representation. Now, let me see if I can get my highlighter here to work. There we go. If we are looking at students at AEDY, primarily between the ages of 12 and 17, 12 and 18, that is the sweet spot for when we tend to diagnose kids as being depressed. Depression is not a young man's game. You don't see a lot of that in the elementary level. It's almost like life hasn't beaten you up enough to earn that diagnosis. But as we get more into that adolescent, we see that's the sweet spot for depression. In terms of anxiety, we see a lot of that among our AEDY youth as well. So both depression and anxiety, those are really the two key mental health attributes here among our older students. Now, with younger students, as defined more elementary age, they might not have a mental health diagnosis, but we see a lot of just unruly behaviors. We also know that boys are more likely than girls to have a mental health or developmental disorder. And we also know that kids in poverty, okay, more than 1 in 5 have a mental health or developmental disorder. So all we're trying to do is get a bit of a picture of who these kids are. So to sum up our opening discussion, alternative ed, who do we most likely find in there? Children from poverty. And as we've talked about last time and we'll talk about today, poverty is your #1 cause of stress among children in this country and families. Kids from poverty, kids who are persistently truant and absent. Over 40% have some sort of a mental health disorder. We're going to find that primarily anxiety and or depression. Most are male. Academically, not very successful. Quite a few may have a criminal background, and there's one universal theme among the kids we're talking about today: trauma, trauma, and trauma. So with that said, let's take a look at trauma, which is a bit of a continuation from our discussion from last time. Let's look at it a little bit more in depth, and I also want to discuss COVID-19, which has been sort of a traumatic event for all of us. Now, when we talk about trauma, that is an overused word these days, no question about it. And for those of you who have followed my career when I talk about reading or writing or math disorders, you know that I like to get into the subtypes of it. Don't just tell me a student has a reading disorder. What kind of reading disorder? There's 4 different subtypes. Is it problem with phonology, or is it dyslexia we call surface dyslexia, poor speed, or is it a comprehension disorder? You have to drill down. Specificity of assessment, as I talk about with psychologists, is the key to specificity of intervention. So when we use this word trauma, it's a bit of a loose term to me. There's all different types of trauma. Bullying, peer victimization, okay, a deliberate attempt to inflict power on someone else, or psychological harm to someone perceived as being less powerful than yourself. That certainly can be physical, verbal, social. And now we're seeing quite a bit of cyberbullying through social media platforms. Trauma can involve community trauma, acts of interpersonal violence, homicides, robberies, shooting, just coming from that, that bad side of town, so to speak. In the trauma literature, we talk a lot about complex trauma, and that's not just one event, that's many events, multiple events. And that could be, for example, sexual abuse over a prolonged period of time that would disrupt many aspects of the child's development, and certainly ability to develop trust and form secure attachments. Early trauma, and by early trauma, that's defined as between birth and age 6. And that can be the result of violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, accidents, war, the list goes on and on. Interpartner or intimate partner violence, a huge, probably the #1 source of trauma in other countries, simply because of really cultural mores and rules with respect to women and their particular obligation in relationships and marriages vastly differs across this planet. And you see a lot of intimate partner violence, humiliation, stalking. It really, this is children are often the silent victims of this, but this is a major source of trauma for women. Pediatric medical trauma, when something, pain, injury, medical procedure, something very frightening happens. The types of trauma I think that typically come to mind when we talk about trauma is either physical abuse, childhood maltreatment, or sexual abuse. And that both of those kind of speak for themselves. So lots of different types of trauma, lots of different sources of trauma. My feeling is that the underlying theme of a lot of our AEDY youth is some aspect of trauma of these various categories that I've talked about. But if you boil it down, what are the specific symptoms that we're looking at with trauma? A lot of anger, a lot of distrust, particularly distrust of those in an authority figure. Who's an authority figure in a school? A teacher and an administrator. because in my home life, that authority figure, often a parent or a caregiver or guardian, is the self-same person who has violated me. So all I've done, I've generalized that violation and that distrust to all authority figures. What I'm saying is it spills over into the school. Persistent feelings of hopelessness, sadness, despair. Memory flashbacks, we see this a lot with PTSD, of the terrifying event or events. A bit of unpredictability when it comes to our emotions. We talked about this one back in December as well. We are always heightened awareness that something might be a threat to us. Our amygdala, that part of the brain that sort of surveys the landscape for threats to us, is working overtime here. So often benign events to a child who's been traumatized is interpreted as a threatening event. A lot of physical symptoms, headaches, especially feelings of guilt as if I'm somehow responsible for the abuse, whether that's physical abuse or sexual abuse. With that comes an altered sense of shame. We talked about those withdrawal feelings, isolation, and hopelessness. And the bottom line is this: I'm not doing well in school. Academic failure, I'm not connected, I'm not interested, I'm flat out not plugged into school. So this is a result of obviously these emotive features are a direct manifestation, as you can see, from just a traumatic, and so many different sources of trauma, traumatic events going on in that child's home life. But for the last 13 months, we can argue that there's been a traumatic event that's hindered all kids, in fact, everyone throughout this planet, and that's been COVID-19. We've all sort of been unplugged from school. We're all trying to desperately plug back in. When you look around the globe, COVID, 90% of students in over 188 countries have experienced a significant disruption to their learning due to this pandemic. And we have been swimming upstream for the last 13 months to try to get in front of this. We know that many children cannot be reached by internet. We can't just go virtual and say, continue with education. A lot of kids don't even have, throughout the world, access to internet-based remote learning due to, technology issues or just lack of those types of assets in the home environment. And we've all been going through, even if you are plugged in, even if you have access to virtual learning, it's not quite the same, is it? Teachers have had to quickly learn how to take a lesson intended for a live audience and now present it virtually, or in some cases in a hybrid model. I'll give you a quick example. I did my first in-person presentation 3 weeks ago to the South Carolina Association of School Psychologists. We had about 20 folks show up in this large conference room. So it wasn't hard to socially distance. Everyone had a table to themselves. But we had 80 or 90 join us virtually. And that was my first experience of trying to deliver a presentation to meet the needs of a live audience and a virtual audience simultaneously. I immediately wanted to just share that experience with every single teacher in public education and say, I truly empathize with what you're going through right now. That is immensely difficult to try to pull that off. So we're all kind of learning how to do this on the fly. We know that students in poverty have been disproportionately impacted by COVID due to limitations of resources. Other folks have just hired private tutors or switched to, there's been a massive influx to private schools, which by and large, a lot of our private schools have remained open throughout this because of their advantage of smaller class sizes and able to socially distance a little bit easier. But we know over the last 13 months, a lot of failing grades with students, a lot of greater absenteeism rate with students. a lot of learning loss, especially in math and in reading. It's already apparent. In many respects, these were some of the same things we might have seen pre-pandemic with our students in middle and high school who were struggling, and we were considering an alternative educational placement because they weren't coming to school, they were failing classes, and so forth. If we can quickly take a little bit of a deeper dive, I want a little bit of a side note into COVID, and I won't belabor this too long. But there is something I do want to discuss about it. COVID, we know there's 7 strains of coronavirus found in humans. In this particular strain, what you have are spike proteins those red little spikes that are binding to what's called ACE2 protein cells. And ACE2 protein, basically, look at that as the front door of a cell. And what these spike proteins can do, the orange, or the red orange here, they can pick the lock. They basically pick the lock and open the door and can infect the cell. The problem is that the good stuff, the ACE2 proteins, are located on cells throughout the body, organs throughout the body. So the virus basically has the keys to the front door of the cell. They've got the keys, and when it attaches to the cell, this is how they enter into the cell, by attaching to these ACE2 proteins. Now, the point that I wanted to make is that by and large, this seems to be primarily an airborne virus, and that what we're seeing is that for a lot of folks, the virus is entering directly into the brain by an area down here. It's called I'll kind of try to highlight it, the piriform cortex. The piriform cortex is in the temporal lobes of the brain. It's all the way up at the front, or the anterior part of the temporal lobes of the brain. Now, all incoming information, whether it's a sense of touch, or something that we see, or something that we hear, all incoming information into the nervous system, into the brain, goes to the thalamus, with one exception. That exception is the sense of smell. The sense of smell directly enters the brain into the piriform cortex, okay? It bypasses the thalamus, and it also gets into a memory center of the brain called the hippocampus. We talked a little bit about that one last time. What are we seeing with COVID? A loss of smell. Even after you've recovered from the physical illness, okay, what tends to linger? A loss of smell. What else? Ageusia, loss of taste, okay? This is all modulated by that piriform cortex. What this is suggesting is the virus is breaking the blood-brain barrier. We know that 1/3 of the cases in Wuhan actually had neurological symptoms. And if we don't want to belabor the point too much, but study after study in Europe has, especially with, the over 65 crowd, has had evidence in cases of, physically we recover from the virus, but what lingers is neurological symptoms. What we're going to find out, at least in my profession, is will we need follow-up psychological and or neuropsychological evaluations down the road for these individuals, not with a mild, not with a moderate, but with more severe viral loadings with respect to the coronavirus. It's just yet again one of these unknowns. Soon, that at this point we will find out as time tells. What we do want to do is not scare everybody regarding the virus. We've had enough of that. Where we are now is bringing kids back into school. And how do we bring kids back into school? The number one thing is there needs to be a buffer that kids, whether you're coming back to school from a 13-month absence due to the pandemic, or you're coming back to school because of a 45-day placement in an AEDY program. I don't care. You want to be successful, you have to feel safe. You have to be comfortable. Establishing trust that this is a safe environment. And I trust the people in charge of this building, in charge of this environment. That's through the administrators, that's through the teachers, that's through the secretaries, that's everyone in that building has my best interest in mind. If I don't feel that way, learning is not going to happen. You have to establish that sense of safety and trust. Educators, we need to be patient. You can't just dive in and pick things up from where we were in February of 2020. We know that math and foreign language require the most continuity of learning than any other academic skill. I would expect gaps, particularly in those subjects. Look, if I'm not in school every day, chances are day to day, I'm reading something in my day-to-day life. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not doing long division unless you tell me I have to do long division, okay? So math is not something we necessarily practice and do day in and day out. Math, as well as foreign language, it's kind of one of, it's like a use it or lose it type of skill. School's going to look different. We might have limitations to the number of students in a class, although we hear that guidelines are changing, at least in schools, with the 6-foot social distancing policy. Now we're hearing perhaps we're going to a 3-foot social distancing policy. We know that's almost next to impossible in the hallways, but the elementary level, they're very, very creative. If you walk into an elementary school these days, these kids learn to walk down the halls with their arms extended. And if you can touch the person in front of you, when you walk down the hall, you're within 3 feet. It's so cute to see, and leave it to 8-year-olds to invent a way to maintain their social distancing in the hallway. Of course, at the secondary level, we do not walk down the halls in single file. So a bit of an issue there. We know that masks, gloves, thermal temperature checks, sanitizer stations, cafeteria restrictions, you might have to eat in your classroom. School's going to look a little bit different. I think we're going to need, and we'll revisit this, access to mental health services. There might be some limitations on sports and extracurricular activities, although I have a daughter who is a varsity basketball player, and they are getting their season in, albeit an abbreviated one. And yes, they are playing with face masks on, so they're adapting and coping and modifying. And I guess with all of these rules and new way of post-pandemic education, I guess we'll be writing a lot more of these behavior plans, because that's what we do for kids, right? And especially when kids coming back, again, not just necessarily from a pandemic, but coming back just from an alternative placement back into the schools, we write behavior plans. And that's where I want to really sort of come full circle. And this is exactly what today's talk, and we've sort of meandered into different topics, but let's kind of tighten this up and bring it together. This is the central theme of my talk today. The central theme is not to eliminate behavior plans, but we need to recognize and acknowledge the limitation of behavior management plans with children. So this slide, is titled Behaviorism, sort of the good, the bad, the ugly. It's after my favorite Clint Eastwood movie. Why do we so rely on behavior management plans? And let's, whether it's for kids coming back from the pandemic to make sure they're wearing their masks, make sure they're social distancing, okay, make sure they're following the new school rules and policies, or whether it's a student coming back from an AEDY program and transitioning into the building, and they have to have behavior management plans with respect to their code of conduct and following rules and attendance. Why the over-reliance on behavior plans? Well, you can go to study after study in the literature. A meta-analysis is a collection of multiple studies, and the reason we use behavior modification is one of the most effective interventions for managing classroom behavior. If I'm a teacher, I cannot impart knowledge in the classroom unless I have some control. I need to be able to manage behavior in the classroom or I cannot deliver my lesson. And that's why behavior management plans are so effective for management. But I'm not a teacher, I'm a psychologist. So I need to go beyond the management of behavior. I need to help with the treatment end of behavior, not just the management. And one of the biggest assumptions we make is that behavior and emotional functioning are the same thing, and you can reinforce it with a behavior management plan. It's not the same thing. I can write as many behavior plans as I want, okay, and use the best stationery the school has to offer. But if I have anxiety or I have depression or I have a mental health disorder, okay, behavior plans are going to help me manage behavior, but they're not a source of treatment. That's the mistake we make with the plans. The goal of a behavior plan is to get and induce a specific behavior in a specific situation, as opposed to treatment, by definition, would be the internalization of self-regulatory behaviors. Here's an example. You know who does a fantastic job with behavior plans, maybe better than anyone? Prisons. Prisons operate by way of reinforcement, both positive and negative, to manage behavior. But once we have served our time and we leave a prison, do you know what the recidivism rate is that we wind up back? It's over 60%. Because once you take those external shackles off of reinforcement and you haven't dealt with the treatment, you're going to default back into your exact same way of behavior. You could make this very, very same case with our students from AEDY types of programs. I guess here's where I'm going with all of this today. The decision each of us has to make when we work with a student, and we talked about who's that student going to be. Is that going to be Billy, the student who we started today, who's very disruptive, or Sam, the student on the spectrum, or Joe, the real bright kid who's not plugged in, or Martin, the fiery redhead? Is that behavior we see due to a lack of will or a lack of skill? You can't reinforce with a behavior plan a skill that the student never possesses. And this, to me, is the central theme of our talk today. When we look at behavior, and it doesn't have to be an either or, it could be a combination of both. But I can tell you that in neuroscience, what we're looking at is called collaborative problem solving. That the behaviors that we are seeing with these students are more a manifestation of a lack of skill. Here's the mantra: kids do well if they can. The deficit and why they wind up in an AEDY program, many times it's a lack of skill, not a lack of will. They don't want to do bad. They don't know how to do well. And the key, as we dive into taking this neuropsychological approach, the key skills that they lack are three: problem solving, flexibility, and managing frustration. Problem solving, flexibility, and frustration tolerance are your big three, all controlled by the frontal lobes of the brain. Now, in our brief time today, if you want to do some extra reading, I cannot recommend these three books enough. Ross Green, I've had the pleasure of presenting with a number of times, really a fantastic presenter. Stuart Oblon as well. He has a book called The School Discipline Fix. Ross has a couple of books, and the classic, the excellent one, The Explosive Child. All of these books, and by the way, both Ross and Stuart are both out of Harvard, and the whole essence of this is we need to teach skills. collaborative problem-solving skills. I'm going to give you a quick little overview of what we mean by that. This is Stuart Ablon's approach, and let's see if we can't. I'm going to jump into a video real quick. So we're going to go. Hopefully, I remember how to do this. New share, and I think we should be set. Let me know. Interrupt if you can't hear this. Here we go.
All of the research in the neurosciences for the past 50 years has shown beyond the shadow of a doubt that challenging kids do not lack the will to behave well. They lack the skills to behave well. Skills to behave well, what kind of skills am I talking about? I'm talking about skills like problem solving, like flexibility, like frustration tolerance. In other words, what all the research in the neurosciences has shown us is that kids who exhibit chronic challenging behavior, you know what? They have like a learning disability, except instead of areas like reading, math, and writing, this learning disability is in areas like problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance. A very wise man who has taught me a lot in his lifetime, he's in his 98th year now, my grandfather. He's taught me a lot. One of the things he taught me early on is he said, when you give a dog a name, eventually they will answer to it. And I have learned that if you treat kids like they are lazy, unmotivated, don't care, aren't trying hard enough, over time, don't be surprised when they start to look like, talk like, and act like they don't care and aren't trying hard enough. And you know what? I don't believe it. I believe kids do well if they can. I have yet to meet the kid that prefers doing poorly to doing well. All of the research in the neurosciences for the past.
Okay, let me jump back in here. One second. Get out of that. Manage and get back in. So that was Stuart Ablon, and his book is called The School Discipline Fix. And that gives you an idea of really where the neurosciences come down on this. It's about teaching skill. And let's take it a step further. We're really talking about, in many ways, self-regulation and the frontal lobes of the brain. Talked a little bit about the frontal lobes last time, but self-regulation, disruptive students, kids in the ADEDY program tend to be unsuccessful because they don't self-regulate in a number of areas. This is all the frontal lobes. Either there's behavioral self-regulation, and they might be destroying property, emotional self-regulation, and their moods are all over the map, or attentional self-regulation, which is what leads to whenever there's any self-regulatory type of problem, our first knee-jerk reaction is you have ADHD. There's not a deficit of attention. The problem is you can't self-regulate your attention. And what we're doing in neuropsychology is trying to identify these core brain regions, in this case, the frontal lobes of the brain, to help teach the skill. This is what we are. We are educators. And if what we're saying is that behavior boils down to a lack of skills, then I think as an educator, I am incumbent to teach that skill. And the skill in this case has to do with adaptive behavioral and coping skills, cognitive flexibility, frustration tolerance, the ability to self-regulate. And all of these skills, I keep talking about the frontal lobes of the brain, you know, this is what we mean. This is a little bit blurry here, but if we were to grab a laser option here, divide the brain up, everything forward here, it represents the frontal lobes of the brain. And this big chunk of real estate here, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is more cognitive executive functions, planning, time management, sustaining my attention, those kinds of things. But we're more interested in teaching these sort of emotional self-regulation skills. That's the orbital frontal cortex, and that's this area right here. And that is really ground zero for where we need to focus our attention in terms of teaching these skills. What does the orbital frontal cortex do? It's responsible for emotional executive function. It's responsible for the self-regulation of behavior. It's really that highest level of the brain that's responsible for reading and reacting to social situations. And so often these kids, and that's the term that I use, if that area of the brain is underdeveloped, you have social dyslexia. In other words, you can read words fine, but you can't read people very well. You can't read nonverbal cues very well. You struggle not only reading social cues and skills in others, but also reading social cues and skills in yourself. That's the area we really need to be addressing. So as we take this talk a little bit more now into the classroom, I know what you're thinking. Well, there's so much on a teacher's plate. I mean, we've lost 13 months of education. We've got to get kids caught up in their math and their reading and their writing. We've got to get them where they were back in February of 2020. You're going to give me more to do. This is just not realistic. How are we going to be teaching these social, emotional, self-regulatory skills, these collaborative problem-solving skills? How about we interject a bit of good news on our discussion? Yeah, this just got passed, didn't it? The American Rescue Plan just got passed. Some of you have you received a $1,400 check? Here's something I'm not sure has been well articulated, and we're not going down a political path here. We're going down what the reality is. This was passed in March of 2021. Nearly I believe $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, of which a very small part is a stimulus check. The part that I want you to focus your attention on is right here. Whoops. Let's see if I can get my highlighter. It's too dark to show up, but the $178 billion for schools, that was a part of this plan. That went to the Department of Education with $122 billion going to the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. IDEA is going to get $3 billion. The American Rescue Plan also includes over $1 billion for services that address mental health and substance use disorders in our kids. $30 million is going to go to Project Aware, which builds mental health awareness and violence prevention in kids. $20 million in funding to youth suicide prevention, $100 million for mental and behavioral health training. That's the good news. Finally, we are, as part of our national infrastructure, putting our money where our mouth is. And to me, this is the money that has to set the following in mind. School community mental health partnerships to set up programs in school to teach these collaborative problem-solving skills. We're talking social emotional learning through self-awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, social awareness, and self-management. I mean, we know this. We know that, look, just teaching kids proper reading, writing, and math, hey, that's great. That's how we think they're going to integrate into society. And those are important skills and probably the most important. But you know what? Good luck holding down a job if the first time a customer disagrees with you, you cuss them out. Good luck holding down a job when you don't come to work on a consistent basis. Why should you? You never came to school on a consistent basis. Good luck integrating and blending in and being a productive contributor to our society without social emotional learning skills. These are skills. If it is a skill, we can teach them. We are educators. Educators teach skills. You have to think beyond just reading, writing, and math. Now the financial infrastructure has been put in place for social, emotional, academic learning, school community, mental health partnerships. And when we approach these skills, you have to layer these correctly. You have to start at the brain and work out to the environment. There's a layer of interventions, whether that's medication management, mindfulness, yoga, neurofeedback. You have to start at the level of the brain to develop a sense of I'm in control of my body calmness. Not teaching is these skills is not going to happen unless that child is in an emotional readiness position to learn. Then we can layer on teaching the problem solving, the frustration tolerance, and the social emotional coping skills, both direct teaching and through counseling, through school community partnerships. Now we have the skill. Now I think you can use the behavior. No one's saying get rid of the behavior management plan. All we said with the behavior management plan is you can't reinforce a skill that the student doesn't already possess. And we forget the middleman here and jump right to the behavior management plan and expect students to behave and act in a certain way when they lack the skills to do that. And let's not forget parent training. Teaching these skills, we start from the brain and work our way to the environment. How about some just real practical things that we can do in the schools just to help curb some of this difficulty with self-regulation, to curb some of the aggression. I think what's worked well for me is spending 20 plus years in the school more than anything, humor, distraction, diffusing situations by making kids laugh or making them forget why they were upset in the first place. Do whatever we can to de-escalate the situation. Give students a means to save face. When they've made bad decisions, give them a couple of more so that there is a balance of power. It's not all heavy-handed, you better do this, or give them a choice, allow them to save face, de-escalate the situation. You have to disengage the current out of control emotion before we can re-engage the new behavior. And that's where the self-calming, the breathing, the mindfulness, we talked a lot about that last time in December. Then we can re-engage a new behavior once we are in a calm state of mind. And keep in mind as educators, this will sound a little funny, I'm okay every now and then if a student loses it, every now and then. And I say that because good teachers approach that as a teachable moment. And while you are approaching a student who is emotionally out of control and dysregulated, and you approach them in a calming, empathetic, and caring manner, think of the example you are setting for every other student watching this situation unfold right before their eyes. It is a teachable moment of empathy, tolerance, and emotional flexibility. Specific things that we want to do perhaps in the classroom. A lot of these are real self-evident. Keep in mind preferential seating. And that's not always apparent, especially with trauma. That's not always by the door because we're worried about who's going to come in the hallway. It's not always by a window. We're distracted there. A lot of times it's by the teacher. Approaching work by chunking it, not letting students be overwhelmed. We talked about smartphone apps. Take advantage of smartphones. Have app breaks throughout the day to induce self-calm and mindfulness. Use of a crisis pass when students are feeling overwhelmed. They just turn their crisis pass over, designate where they go next, just take a bit of a timeout. Having a school coach, having a go-to person, check in with those students daily. A lot of misbehavior occurs during transitions, giving the student a 2-minute, okay, we're gonna put our pencils down and we're gonna open to page 64, 1 minute, okay, in 30 seconds, that 2-minute countdown or warning, because a lot of times disengaging from one task, re-engaging to the next one, that can be a real issue. Creating a quiet zone in the class with headphones, and no, we're not going to be listening to new age music, but oftentimes those headphones, we want a caregiver or a mom or a dad to take that cell phone and use that voice memo app and make a tape that the student can listen to, such as Billy, if you can hear our voice today, please know that we love you. We know you're going to make a good decision. From time to time throughout the day, we do get frustrated. That's okay to have those feelings. We know you're going to make a good decision. Remember to use your breathing. Remember to calm down. Those are the messages we want kids to hear over and over and over again, not the ants. You know what an ant is? A-N-T, an automatic negative thought that goes something like this. I don't belong here. My teacher hates me. I'm stupid. Okay, we want to get rid of the ants and reinforce a better message. school community partnerships, a lot of times having a mirror on a student's desk so that they can see what a disheveled emotion looks like, and more than anything, model empathy and compassion. That's what we do as educators. That's a teachable moment as frequently as we can. Look, guys, one of the real, just a couple more points, incredible differences that we have seen has been also through therapeutic animals and canine assisted therapy. This is an option that's going on with a lot of alternative settings and placements, and it's been amazing with these kids that don't really connect to any human beings. Watch them with an animal. It's unbelievable. Animals provide unconditional warmth and positive emotions. They're not like me and try to over-explain everything and give sage advice, but simply provide a pathway to heal. From a neuroscience standpoint, they secrete, just by petting their fur, oxytocin, which lowers our heart rate and blood pressure, reduces social isolation and loneliness. Hey, there's a book out by Guy Bacon called The Dogs of Newtown. Guy Bacon lost his little sister during that horrible Sandy Hook shooting in December of 2012. Did you know all those families were provided an emotional support animal that to this day they still have, and not to replace their lost loved one, but just as a pathway to heal. And that's what Guy Bacon's book is all about, The Dogs of Newtown. So if we were to quickly sum up and bring our webinar to a conclusion in the next 2 minutes, don't rely on a singular intervention to address complex behavioral and emotional pathology. Just writing a behavior plan, not enough. Layer interventions from an inside to outside fashion, from the brain to the environment. Let's not just blame parents, bring them in as part of the solution, empower them. Sometimes we get frustrated as educators. Sometimes we need to time ourselves out because we can lose our emotions easily with these children as well. I love school-wide incentives such as positive behavioral and structural support, PBIS schools, that really change the culture of schools to try to make it more pro-social and character, changing the culture and climate, and just overall tone of the building. Avoid moral narcissism. You know, oh, of course, Billy acts that way. Look at the family. Look at the street they live on. Look at them. Avoid the moral narcissism. Approach these students like, okay, they lack this skill. I'm an educator. I can teach this. It's not a lack of will. It's a lack of a skill. So in conclusion, lastly, we are, and as you heard from Gina's introduction, I am spending most of my time these days working with PAR in the area of test development. And there are certainly products out there, trauma symptom checklists for kids and for young kids out there that can help screen children for trauma. There are certainly anxiety scales out there as well that you can progress monitor students with anxiety. Finally, last slide, just to throw this out your way. One of our big projects we've been working on in the pandemic is our Pfeiffer Assessment of School Trauma Scale. We expect this to be released this late summer, early fall. This will be a scale that's going to look at the physiological, behavioral, emotional, and academic impacts of trauma. It's going to be digital, take about 10 minutes, a teacher scale, a parent scale, a student scale. It'll also include to what extent that student has developed core resiliency types of skills as well. The goal of all of this, and through measurement, again, if we can sum up our talk in one phrase, we're going to approach these kids not that they're just being bad and defiant and lack the will. Certainly there is that undercurrent. We're going to approach them that they lack the skill. And as educators, we can make a difference. Whew. With that said, Gina, I think that brings our webinar to a conclusion. Should we move on? I'm sure there's 1,000 questions. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And yes, Dr. Pfeiffer, there are many questions, and I want to thank our attendees today, our participants, for continuing to communicate with us as you're providing us all these great resources and things to consider. That you know, certainly the things that we're doing and that are required as part of our practice are not the end all be all in terms of our result, without considering first and foremost our instruction and our delivery, and certainly recognizing, you know, what and where our students are experiencing trauma. So the first question I have for you actually goes back to that original slide on recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, inclusive of certainly the COVID pandemic, and that students are going to be transitioning back in a variety of means and methods. And so the first attendee had asked, what recommendations would you make to support avoidance and to school avoidance, and to support that participation, whether that be through virtual means or through in-person, because the experience of truancy, we know, is not a reason for being removed from general education. In fact, that has been removed from our criteria. But we do also recognize that students aren't attending. So what would you recommend to actively engage the skill that you've mentioned throughout presentation?
So as I understand it, it's a really good question, Gina. These kids are avoiding school as a result of the pandemic because they're scared to be back. And how do we promote that sense of safety and trust once again? We do it slowly. We do it in a series of gradual steps. And I don't think it's a whole lot different than with a school phobic type of kid. That gradual systematic desensitization, where currently here in Maryland, our districts that are back only on a hybrid model, and children have the choice. It's about 60-40, and if they're not comfortable being in the building, then they can tune in online. What I would encourage is to try just one day to come in for part of the day, but a series of gradual steps, because if a child is not feeling safe and not feeling comfortable, they're not going to learn. But keep in mind, peer pressure goes a long way. And as their friends begin to come back and activities begin to come back, and I'd like to be in the school play or play on the basketball team or be in this club, all of those are going to help us take that first step, but let's approach it slowly.
Thank you. The second question comes with the topic of executive functioning, which we, you know, see in the presentation of many student behaviors. And so the question asked is, can you give us specific interventions and what to look for with, you know, with executive functioning to be able to address that area of need?
Yeah, there are two people who have wonderful books out with tons of interventions. Pam Dawson. If you want to grab DAWSON, Pam Dawson's book on executive functioning for educators has charts and checklists and strategies and wonderful things. Remember, executive functioning is a very broad term. What specifically are we talking about? Poor time management, inability to sustain our attention, poor planning, poor organization, what specific areas? I love Pam Dawson's book for educators. And also, not far from where you are, Gina, in Harrisburg, is my good friend George McCloskey, who has his book, Essentials of Executive Functioning Assessment, that's put out by Wiley. It's not just the assessment, but there are tons of strategies for educators as well. Those are two wonderful resources. Just keep in mind, executive function is a very broad-based term. And what I like about both George and Pam, they break it down specifically. What attribute of executive functioning are we struggling with? And sort of a step-by-step approach for educators.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate all the resources, as I'm quick to write them down, and we absolutely will compile the list of evidence-based practices and resources that you've mentioned today for our field. So the last question I have here from our participants is focusing on transition, not just transition from our AEDY programs into or back to the general education setting, but also the transition back from being off ultimately, whether that off mean off screen or just simply not engaging in what we would consider to be typical educational programming. What would you recommend be our starting point, was the question. Where to begin? So you had addressed timing and certainly to take things day by day. But what evaluative features would you say would be necessary for for our field to engage students back in programming?
I wouldn't even worry about academics. It's a matter of feeling safe in the building. You know, it's funny. My youngest is in high school, and you know, like everyone else, she's been displaced for a year, and she is one of those model students. Loves school, totally motivated. I can tell you, she is sleeping till noon. She's barely tuning in. This became the new norm for her. And when they opened up schools and said, we're going back on a hybrid basis, her first reaction, this is a straight A model student, her first reaction was, I don't know if I really want to do that. I'm kind of good where I'm at right now. And I imagine a lot of students have adjusted and said, well, this is just going to be our new norm. But once she got back in, after about the third or fourth day, it was great. And I think she forgot how wonderful it was to feel connected again. And that's the key. Look, if we bring students back and try to expect them to be where we think they should be academically and just dive right in, I think that's going to be a mistake. I think the key is to bring our students back in. There's going to be gaps in their education. We're going to meet them where they are, but let's put the academics aside. And let's all of us, not just students, but faculty as well, let's just get plugged in again. And let's relearn how wonderful it is to establish that human connection. And I think that's the key, and the rest will follow.
Well, thank you. With that, I want to thank you again for this great hour. I know we could have spent lots more time, and we may in the future spend lots more time working through and supporting, supporting our students. So with that, if there's anything else, we will absolutely stay on the call, our AEDY team, to support our attendees today. And again, a big thank you to Dr. Pfeiffer for all this great information and things for us to consider moving forward.
Thanks again for having me, Gina. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye-bye.